relaxation is the term we use when we talk about the cardiac cycle. So when the heart's relaxing.
Is it C?
So again, if this was on the lecture exam, you would have the diagram. But if we look at our cycle, we have ventricular pressure doing this, atrial pressure doing this, and aortic pressure doing that. Okay? So these two periods of time are our isovolumetric periods when all the four valves are closed. All two sets of valves are closed. So ventricular relaxation occurs on this side. Is this relaxation or is this relaxation?
Right.
This one is. So at the end of isovolumetric relaxation, we're at this line right here. All right? So are the semilunar valves open or closed?
What, up there or down there?
At this point? Semilunar valves are closing here, so they close at the beginning and they're still closed at the end. AV valves
Open.
open. So when AV valves open,
B.
beginning of ventricular filling.
When does semilunar close again? On the,
The semilunar valves close
At the top.
as soon as ventricular pressure drops below aortic pressure.
oh, okay.
So the aortic valves are closed, but they will have closed at the beginning of isovolumetric relaxation, not at the end. Does that make sense?
Valves closed.
That's why we have isovolumetric, because both sets of valves are closed.
Oh. Okay.
So semilunar valves will close at the beginning of isovolumetric relaxation. AV valves are already closed. And at the end of isovolumetric relaxation,
D and E.
AV valves open. Okay? So that's the beginning of ventricular filling. So is ventricular pressure lower than aortic pressure at that time?
Yes.
Yeah. You can see it on the diagram. Is ventricular pressure lower than atrial pressure?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, that's why ventricular filling occurs, because the AV valves have opened.
Ooh, that's good.
Okay?
Did you make that diagram?
Huh?
Did you make that diagram?
No? All right. The next question. The ECG strip indicates a slowing of the conductance of the impulse through ventricular contractile cells because of what? Now, before you get all nervous, what I told the morning class, what their assignment was over the weekend, was to develop the confidence that they knew this material and not panic when they read a question like this. So I'm not asking you the cause of this ECG. All right, this is not a class in reading ECGs. So go back and read the question. We're looking at the change in ventricular contractile cells. What part of the ECG has to do with ventricular contractile cells? QRS and T-wave. So what's happening to the ventricular contractile cells during the QRS?
Their ventricles are
What causes the QRS wave in our ECG?
ventricles are
Ventricular
Depolarization.
depolarization, okay? And the T-wave is ventricular
Repolarization.
repolarization. So if we are decreasing the time it takes to conduct the current through the ventricular
A
cells,
shorter distance.
what's going to happen? That's depolarization, right? So we're looking at our QRS wave, and if we're increasing the time rather, slowing of the conductance, so we're increasing the time it takes for that to occur, what's going to happen to the QRS? It's going to widen because it's going to take more. Remember, each little block is 0.04 seconds of time. So that's what you see here. The first thing is the tinting of the T wave. This happens in hypokalemia, but I'm not asking that. I'm just asking you to interpret the graph. All right? And so you can see this is a normal amount of potassium outside the cell. Then we go to 7, 8, 10, 11, and 12. And so you can see what's happening more dramatically here to here to here to here. It's taking longer for that wave to pass through the cells. And that's all this question is asking.
So C.
So you don't even have to know that it's a potassium effect. All right? It means it's a reading of the ECG. knowing that the QRS is ventricular contractile depolarization.
Oh, so it's C.
Mhm.
Oh, okay. Yeah, all right.
Okay? But again, I don't want you to go, wait a minute, I thought you're asking us to interpret the ECG. No, I'm asking you to, based on what we know about the ECG, what would this change, how would this change be indicated? Here I'm asking you to interpret the ECG.
Okay.
The enlarged P wave, what's shown in red here, on this ECG indicates what?
The atrium.
Mitrals and
Again, did you have to know that enlarged P waves were caused by mitral stenosis to read this from the answers that are based up there? No, you needed to know your ECG. So, AV nodal block, when is the current going through? What do we see at what point on our ECG is the current going through the AV node?
P.
During the
Q. PQ.
PQ interval. Is that question about the PQ, PQR interval? No. All right. Prolonged conductance through the ventricles, we just saw
QRS.
that with the previous question. So that's going to be our QRS. Increased venous return.
T.
That's really not going to change the atria. Okay, so again, even if you didn't know what change in the ECG was due to mitral stenosis, you could pick out what area we're looking at, because when does the current go through the atria? P wave. With mitral stenosis, there's a backflow into the atria, it enlarges, and it takes longer for that to happen, so we see an enlarged P wave. I'm getting a little bit closer to
That's heart block.
reading it, to
The
interpreting an
myocardial
ECG.
infraction. Elevated ST.
Elevated ST segment, and that's what you can see here. The S doesn't go all the way down.
Heart attack, right?
Okay?
Hope that's a test question.
This ECG illustrates,
The P and the T.
remember these are made up, all right? An absent P wave is caused by atrial fibrillation, so I'm not making up the relationships between the
E.
ECG change and the pathology.
E.
Because some of the P's
Some are
like
close,
QRS,
some are far
just-
away. Okay, and it's the PR interval that's affected by an AV nodal block. In fetal circulation, right and left ventricles pump the same stroke volume. Yes, they always have to, unless we have some problem, or it will cause a problem if they don't. Right and left ventricles pump with the same stroke pressure.
I didn't think the pressure was the same.
Pulmonary
The
pressure
volume,
is
yes.
greater than systemic pressure. Think about our fetal circulation. When the blood comes into the right atria, it can go through the foraminal valley over to the left ventricle. Why does it do that? Partly because of the angle it comes in is directed at the foraminal valley, partly because it's easier to do that. Why would it be easier? Pressure is greater in the right ventricle. If blood does go into the pulmonary trunk and it reaches the ductus arteriosus, does it keep going in the pulmonary trunk, or will it divert into the ductus arteriosus? Diverts. Would it do that if pressure was greater in the aorta? No. So the fact that it diverts from the pulmonary trunk to the aorta shows you that pulmonary pressure is greater than systemic pressure. Okay. See what I mean by thinking it through? There are facts about each of these questions that you know. Just need the confidence in the fact that you know them. Okay? Monoamine oxidase inhibitor. It itself may not function to do this, but would result in. So this is similar to the previous question on blood pressure. So if we have, would we have more norepinephrine or less norepinephrine if we had given somebody a monoamine oxidase inhibitor? Exactly, we would have more. So with more norepinephrine, would we have an increase in intracellular calcium ions? Yes. Because norepinephrine increases cyclic AMP, which opens calcium channels. Would we increase heart rate? Yes, norepinephrine opens our funny channels earlier and more of them. Would there be a prolonged PR interval? No. Would there be a decrease in cardiac output? No. Increase in stroke volume?
Yes.
Because of those calcium ions. Okay? This is just showing the MAO.
Well, that's the,
Okay, which of the following
T-wave.
events are occurring during the period marked by the number what? What is that event?
T-wave.
The T wave, and what is the event occurring in the heart that results in an ECG demonstrating a T wave?
Ventricular valves are open.
Well, what's the current event first? What is the heart doing that the ECG shows as a T wave?
Ventricles repolarizing.
Ventricles repolarizing, okay? So ventricles are repolarizing, they depolarized here, they're repolarizing here. So if we relate that to this, about approximately where would we see that?
The isovolt, right at the end of injection.
Beginning of isovolumetric relaxation,
Yeah.
okay?
So right at the end of
So
injection.
current is passing through the AV node or bundle branches. Of the T wave? No. We already said that's going to be in the PQ-PR interval, so that would not be it. Atrioventricular valves are open. They're open. Depending on where we are, they can be open. So maybe we could change it to that. Are opening. They are open.
They're starting to open.
Or maybe open, depending on where we are. Okay? Ventricular ejection is slowing down. Yes. All right. So for ventricular ejection to be slowing down, our valves have to actually be open. Dichotic notch appears. What's the dichotic notch?
They're at the-
Yeah.
they're there.
So that's occurring with repolarization. Okay. Funny channels are open. So how do we relate funny channels? I've done this with you before, but let's do it again. How do we relate funny channels to our ECG? Let me draw the ECG up here. So here, nothing is happening in the heart, right? As far as atria or ventricles depolarizing. What are the autorhythmic cells in the SA node doing? They are depolarizing. So our funny channels are open here. Funny channels and transient calcium channels reach threshold, and we have an action potential. That current flows into the atria. The atria depolarize, and we see a P wave as the atria depolarize. That current passes through the AV nodes, AV bundles, and reaches the QRS. And the QRS depolarizes, and then the ventricles repolarize. Okay? So at the time that we have repolarization of the ventricles, here, what are the funny channels doing? Are they open?
Yeah.
Yes. Because they're depolarizing until the next P wave is reached. Okay? Now, the slow calcium channels have to do with our contractile cells. So the contractile cells of the ventricles are going to depolarize and do this in relationship. Now again, this is one cell, okay? This is a wave of events going through. So this is our slow calcium channels here, and they've closed by the time we get to this point, or they are closing. All right, that's a different question. Okay, any questions on that? So each P wave is instigated by the action potential of our autorhythmic cells, and then we start creating that depolarization until we get to the next action potential, which causes the next P wave. Okay? The slow calcium channels are in our ventricular muscles, and if we're relaxing, all right, those calcium channels are going to be closed, and it's the potassium channels that are open, allowing the complete repolarization. All right, which of the following events has already occurred just prior to 3? So we're talking about, I make it look like this is happening a little quicker than me. So this happens just prior.
Oh, you're going through all your,
Sorry. Like what?
Exactly.
All right, so just prior to P, just prior to our atrial depolarization, this is our fast calcium channel right here. Look at Christmas tree, all right? But that's, the fast calcium channel is open because that's our action potential that triggered P. So that has to have already occurred because that's what causes P to occur. Are the AV valves open?
No.
What closes the AV valve?
what closed the AV valve? Ejection?
Ventricular pressure. Have the ventricles started to contract yet? No, because that doesn't happen until here. So the AV valves are still open. Okay? What about the semilunar valves? Are they open yet? No. Because what opens the semilunar valves? Same thing that closes the AV valves, ventricular pressure, and they haven't started to contract. Okay? So semilunar valves are not open. The funny channels and the SA autorhythmic cells are not open because we haven't gotten to that point yet. They just opened and closed. Funny channels and the AV node are still open. Why? Remember, it takes them longer. So here our SA node fired, okay, and then our AV node is going to fire when that gets to it, but that hasn't happened yet until we're on the other side of atrial depolarization. It's the current going through the P wave that causes the AV node to fire. Does that make sense? If we don't have an SA node, then the AV node will fire, but at a slower rate. But in a normal heart, the SA node fires first, and then goes through the atria as a conducting current through each of the contractile cells. And when that wave of contractile cell current passes through the atria, that's what causes the AV node to fire. So it's still trying to depolarize. It doesn't know it's going to get washed over by a big tsunami of current from the atrial cells. Okay, so there are plenty of channels that are still open. Okay, digitalis. It functions to do what? What does it do to heart rate? Slows it down. And what does it do to ventricular contraction? Increases it. Okay? It slows it down because of its effect on the AV node. It causes ventricular contraction, so it's an agonist to norepinephrine, but it doesn't bind to the norepinephrine receptor. It's an agonist because it increases calcium ions. And it does so because it decreases the effect of sodium-potassium pumps. Now, I mentioned this briefly, but I didn't harp on it. So what happens is we have, in our contractile cells, we have several different mechanisms. Remember, calcium comes in from outside the cell as well as from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So calcium has come into the cell. And then as the cell is recovering, it uses sodium ions to exchange a sodium, actually free sodium, or a calcium. If we don't have a sodium, if our sodium potassium pump doesn't work, the calcium stays inside the cell. And we have more calcium. So we end up with more, a greater force of contraction. Will that increase stroke volume? Yes. Will that decrease heart rate? And it will because of a different function. Okay? So digitalis interferes with the sodium-calcium exchanger. Hence, more calcium stays in the cell. With more calcium, the volume is stronger. The decrease in heart rate is actually a different function on the AV node, but it does decrease heart rate. You guys remember what cardiac tamponade is?
Over 100, over heartbeat over 100.
Fluid,
Oh.
extra fluid in the pericardial cavity. So is that going to increase or decrease stroke volume? Decrease stroke volume and therefore increase heart rate. The heart can't fill as much, so it has to beat faster. And every time it beats and contracts, more fluid fills the space that it has. Okay, acetylcholine. Does it bind to ligand-gated ion channels on our SA nodal cells? Ionic, ionotropic, or metabotropic channels?
Ionotropic. I thought you said
It does bind to ionotropic cells, but those are on postganglionic autonomic neurons. Does it affect G protein?
G protein.
Does it open the potassium channel through G protein mechanism, or does it bind to a potassium channel and cause it to open directly? It does it through G protein. Okay, so it's not binding to the ion, the potassium ion channel. It binds to a G protein regulated receptor. The inhibitory G units will decrease cyclic AMP, so that shuts down our funny channels. And the excitatory, the GS, so both of these, this would be correct if I had GI there. Okay, so it activates the G protein, but it happens to be an inhibitory G protein. So it inhibits adenylyl cyclase and it binds to and keeps the transient calcium channels closed. That's what the inhibitory one does. The excitatory one, the GS, opens the potassium channels. So the receptor itself doesn't do anything directly as far as allowing ions or in or out. It's not an ion channel. It closes calcium channels and opens potassium channels with an excitatory or inhibitory G protein. Now you have these diagrams of the lower ones on the lower bottom of the page on the cardiac cycle practice worksheet. You probably saw some of them on the quizzes. All right, or you both take it tonight. So, remember I said to review these
yes.
and be able to identify what channel or what type of potential is present.
Mm-hmm.
So what cell is illustrated here?
Autorhythmic,
The autorhythmic cell, contractile
contractile,
cell,
skeletal,
and skeletal muscle cell. All right, so A
calcium,
is
voltage-gated,
called by what?
calcium,
Calcium,
voltage-gated,
voltage-gated calcium channels, resulting in the depolarization form of our action potential. B,
what?
B,
Repolarization of
repolarization
potassium,
due to voltage-gated
potassium,
potassium.
The L stands for
All right, C, now in our contractile cell,
voltage-gated sodium,
voltage-gated sodium. The D,
calcium,
calcium
repolarization,
and
potassium,
so, I thought I changed this. The calcium is actually going to be depolarization, but it's slow depolarization.
For A though, why is it L and not, I mean, how would you indicate fast calcium? versus-
Well, it's just, I usually put it in parentheses, but You could say, I mean, it is a fast calcium channel.
Oh, fast and longer.
Yes. And the transients are quick, but they're slow to open and they don't open very long. This is opens quickly, but doesn't stay open. It stays open longer than the transient ones do. Okay. E, back to voltage-gated potassium.
Potassium, yeah.
F,
Um,
skeletal muscle, that's our typical
sodium,
one that you already heard.
voltage-gated.
Voltage-gated sodium. G,
voltage-gated potassium.
voltage-gated potassium. H,
Ligand-gated.
ligand-gated
Sodium.
sodium, usually with
Sodium.
acetylcholine, that's going to be a sodium. And then finally, over here on the beginning of our depolarization for the autorhythmic cells,
What is that?
the graded potential, but voltage-gated.
Open
Oh,
with
resting
negative.
membrane potential, I missed I,
Oh.
resting membrane potential.
Oh.
Okay, and then J, our voltage-gated funny channels, but it is a graded potential, so this is kind of an anomaly.
Okay, so.
Our voltage-gated channels are typically graded, are action potentials. And then K, just prior to the threshold, transient, good.
Now, how come you don't put an L on that? Because it's not long enough.
Oh, I was pretty close on that one.
So these are both long-lasting, but these are fast and these are slow. I know. If it's fast, how could it be long-lasting? It's talking about how long it takes to open.